We're going to Scotland and the story of the crime boss named Jamie Iceman Stevenson, who's pleaded guilty to a phenomenal amount of cocaine importation in the courts there. But it's interesting because he's probably the Christy Kinahan Senior of the Scottish crime landscape. And he's already served a massive big sentence. He was really out of jail, in jail for a decade, out of jail for a decade. It looks like he's going back in now for a very long period of time. Hasn't been sentenced yet on this, but the value of the cocaine alone he pleaded guilty to was 76 million quid's worth, which was hidden in banana boxes and found in Dover in 2020. But he rose back very quickly again. I think there has been calls by politicians in Scotland to do something about this, that somebody who's a career criminal can't serve a sentence, get out and build up their empire again. How do you police that?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I suppose you see, the parallels with Ireland. I mean, Scotland is a country of comparable size, obviously different population, but something equivalent. And I think I remember you saying to me that an investigator had said to you once, I don't know why you're always focusing on these young fellas. It's the old fellas that are pulling the strings. And Jamie Stevenson would be an example of one of those guys. I mean, I think he's 59, is he? 60 years old. Fella? Well, it's not young anyway, but obviously.
Not the new 40s?
Well, I suppose it could be. But I suppose you see that in Scotland actually covers crime quite similarly to Ireland in the newspapers, and there's a lot of young gangsters in it, but it's still probably...
We generally feel quite akin to Scotland, like they're our brethren, don't we?
Well, we do, and even the criminals have ties. I mean, the Kinahan cartel, if you Google Scotland and the Kinahan cartel, you'll see hundreds of stories about them, because the Kinahans obviously set up a kind of a franchise model across the UK as well as Ireland, where they would sort of sponsor individual gangs and obviously supply them with guns and drugs. And they had a kind of a client gang in Scotland known as the Lions Gang, and it became a political issue because there was a former crime reporter, Russell Finlay, who now is a member of
Parliament,
member of Parliament in the Scottish Parliament, and he kind of brought up those ties and spoke about them in Parliament under privilege. So the connections with Ireland and Scotland are very long term.
He spoke about, in particular, it was around the time and aftermath of the sanctions, and I interviewed him on this podcast as well, Russell Finlay. He spoke about the infiltration of mobs like the Kinahans into football in Scotland and into other sporting activities like boxing. Yeah. And of course it was around the time that Johnny Morrissey, who was married to a Scots woman, Nicola Morrissey, and got married in Scotland, that his Nero vodka was attempting to sponsor a football team.
Exactly. And look, if you see Jamie Stevenson, he's known as the Iceman and also known as the Bull. Apparently he was, if you go back far enough, he was being called the Bull. But
what was the Iceman about? It sounds a bit sinister, doesn't it? It sounds like he's a big ice pick and he's coming after you.
I don't know, but Jamie Stevenson...
probably sold ice creams. There's a very interesting documentary series on, it's either Sky or Netflix at the moment. It's a 3-parter, which is about all I can cope with at the moment. And it's about the Scottish ice cream wars.
Oh, really? I've heard of it, yeah. I mean, the ice cream wars, I suppose the drugs gangs were always running these ice cream vans for various reasons. And it happened in Dublin as well.
Well, they built these housing estates, as always, it's back to social problems. They built these housing estates with no shops. Yeah. So the vans had to go in to supply the local community with their actual groceries. Yeah. And obviously then came the ice cream vans, and then sort of criminal element became involved in it, and then they started really carving out their own turf. Yeah, because they were obviously selling heroin as well as ice cream.
Yeah, and also it's the one of the ways in which people launder money is these cash businesses. You can't imagine more of a cash business than an ice cream van floating around.
It got filthy because there was basically a firebomb attack on a family home it was in a flat actually, and there was 5 or 6 members of the family, including young children. Yeah. A baby killed, and it was very traumatic scenes in the community as they laid out their dead at the top of the church. And this was kind of the culmination of greed and all the rest of it. It's interesting. I won't ruin the rest of it for you, but you should throw an eye over it if you get a chance. But perhaps maybe some of our Scottish listeners could correct me if I'm wrong, but maybe he was sort of floating around that he got the name the Iceman.
Yeah, well, I mean, Jamie Stevenson, he has the same movements as really the Kinahans again. I mean, if you look at the names of the geography mentioned in this case, he was based in Portabanus for a good period of time. He seems to have spent a good bit of time in Dubai, and ultimately he was arrested most recently in Holland. So Jamie Stevenson has become has followed that same pattern that Christy Kinahan Sr. has as well. He was involved in I suppose regular crime up until the kind of turn of the century or before, when the big drugs boom came in. He was one of the first people in Scotland to be dealing in that sort of multi-million pounds, I suppose, in Scotland worth of drugs. He has been linked to gun crime, gun murders. He was at one point charged with one of the most notorious murders in the Scottish underworld, the murder of a guy called Tony McGovern, he had been Jamie Stevenson's best man. Jamie Stevenson had been his best man. There was a dispute it is believed, over money. Jamie Stevenson was, in the UK, it's slightly different, where you can be charged, but then they have to take it to another level where you're kind of really charged. I'm sure that's not the correct term, but ultimately he was released without charge. But I suppose he became regarded as maybe the biggest importer of cocaine as that boomed in the early part of the 2000s into Scotland.
And like in 2003, the Scottish police set up Operation Folklore against him. It took 4 years for them to bring him before the courts for money laundering at that point. So that was in 2007. He got 12 years and 6 months or something like that, but was back out by 2012.
Yeah, I mean, you heard the sort of levels of money that was going on in that case, where they again, another sort of thing that has started to happen in Ireland. It was one of the first few times, I think, that those sort of bugged conversations were being used in the Scottish court. And they're talking, you can hear them talking in the Scottish accents, which I won't try and repeat, about the movement of hundreds of thousands of pounds worth of euros. And he was laundering that money then, where I think he bought 57 Rolex watches or something like that. So he had the drugs cash.
One for every week of the year and a few left over,
56 luxury watches, roughly worth something, I can't remember exactly what it was, like 100,000 each. So that was a way of laundering the money. And he was also he was involved in a taxi firm and also the buying of cars. So he ultimately went away for that period of time and came out in...
It was 2014, actually, rather than 2012. My mistake.
2014.
That he came out.
So he came out in his late 40s, approaching 50 years old.
He missed the recession. He spent the recession in jail and came back out in 2014, where I suppose, that point we're nearly into the second cocaine boom, aren't we?
We're into the second cocaine boom, and you can see. In his trial just last week, he ultimately pled guilty in the middle of the case. I think it was a good few days into the case, and he pled guilty. And you could hear again details of his conversations, of course, taken from Encrochat this time, where he was using the handle, what was it, Elusive Ale. And you can hear him discussing, he's at this high level of drug importation where, rather than receiving, say, we talked about the Kinahan franchise, where you'd have a Scottish gang who'd basically have the drugs delivered to them in Scotland, and they'd be at the point of distributing that, and that would become their business. The Kinahans would step away from that. Stevenson was one of these guys who was arranging the importation at all levels. So, I mean, that's where he's called, and there is a discussion on Encrochat where they're talking about life-changing work they're doing in terms of the money that they were going to make.
I mean, there was a drug, sort of a tablet factory found linked to him, and I think that was also came off the Encrochat phone hack. It was raided, and there was, it was pumping out those street tablets, wasn't it?
Yeah, the benzodiazepines or whatever name they were being under. So you're talking about somebody who's at that level, and in the cocaine importation, like he's arranging that shipment from Central America, actually. But he's not just receiving it, he's arranging it for it to be delivered to Glasgow Fruit Market. He's arranging for it to be put in crates of bananas, 119 different packages. So the level of money there, as he discussed amongst his co-accused, they're set to make this absolute fortune. You're talking these big one-off hits of maybe being set to make 30, 40 million off a shipment like that. That's worth maybe even more. 74 million sterling was the value given. So he ultimately gets picked up in connection. After that, those drugs are seized in Dover in 2020, which is one of probably the main port, isn't it, in the UK, for where all these shipments come in.
The date is important in that. I think it was September.
Yeah.
Or certainly it was after the kind of the Encro phone hack was revealed.
Yes.
Now, if that shipment was arranged on Encro, you'd imagine everybody would have abandoned it. But of course, it was probably on its way.
It's probably on its way. And, exactly. It's probably on its way. So he's picked up, obviously not caught in direct connection with the drugs seizures, but certainly goes on the run, knows what is coming for him probably, and he moves over to Holland.
It's extraordinary that a court would give somebody like him bail.
It is. It's absolutely, especially with that criminal history there.
And what he's facing. I mean, he knows he's looking at he's looking at 20 plus years here,
100%.
I imagine, even though he's pleaded on this, that'll get him a little bit. But it's such a vast amount of drugs with his background, his previous convictions, the fact that he's come out of jail and gone straight back into the game. He's looking at a hefty sentence. Like, you would just presume a guy like that would have the money and the will to go missing. I'm personally surprised he stayed in Europe.
Well, yes, and I mean, it probably is surprising, but he wasn't actually traced directly, it was through
somebody else they were looking at that he was out jogging with.
Yeah, so it was another Scottish criminal he was staying with in Holland, in a sort of relatively nondescript part of it. And coincidentally, at least, they seem to have been after this other Scottish criminal. He'd been wanted in Scotland as well. He's not named in the proceedings. I presume he's still facing charges. And they go and stake him out and go to arrest him, and they find him jogging with this guy who gets picked up. And they find out I think he was named as one of the 12 most wanted men in the UK, and that's how he got caught. Interestingly, we had a case, and I think Eamon did a podcast with you, did he, last year about a fake passport ring, and that it became of interest to us in Ireland because Christy Kinahan Senior was one of the guys who had got one of these fake passports. It was the old story of, where they get a sort of a stooge or whatever, and they used his birth cert. They go and somebody who's never had a passport before.
Usually somebody from the homeless community or sort of a vulnerable drug user or something like that, who is unlikely to probably clean up their act, get a passport and start to travel. Yeah,
like a really old scheme, and it was being run by, I suppose, OAP criminals really, wasn't it, in the UK, who'd been involved in various things previously, but they were running this passport ring for kind of high-level criminals. And in the court proceedings, I think 10 of them were named, and both Christy Kinahan Senior and Jamie Stevenson were two of the guys who got the passports off them. Yeah. So it just, I suppose, shows you that kind of...
See, I suppose for them, if it works, why change it?
If it works, why change it? But it also shows, like, there's probably this elite sort of crew, isn't there, in the criminal underworld of kind of older guys who've known each other 20, 30 years.
There's a finite amount of them, really, and of course they will always have crossed paths, and
you can just see that in the circles that they move in. And Christy Kinahan Senior certainly, was very much a part of that scene across the UK and in Amsterdam. In fact, you probably could pick out 50 names from across Europe that they all interact. And of course, then it's happened again with the younger generation, what the super cartel, as it's being called, which is just the younger generation doing the same. These people, they don't like to have to rely on each other because they don't trust each other. Nor should you trust each other, but because they will use each other, but they do all know each other. And there's a small group of elite criminals, I suppose, operating in those circles. And Jamie Stevenson was one of them.
So he is due to be sentenced kind of in the next couple of months, and the court system is not totally dissimilar to here.
No,
and the mitigating circumstances are not totally dissimilar. Our laws are very similar to the UK, I think. So, on the basis of what he's been put before the courts on, it'll be interesting to see what sentence he gets.
Yeah, I mean, they all get long sentences. Now you can, they have a greater remission of those sentences, don't they? Where they sort of tend to serve 50% of them often.
I don't know whether we have repeated that, but I'm not 100% sure that is totally true, actually.
But they get out on licence a bit longer, I think, and the licensing is more strict. So when you are released, they tend to have far more strict. And you saw that even with another, infamous criminal, Curtis Warren, Cocky Warren, who's also featured on this podcast. He was given a suspended sentence for breaching the terms of his release, which were very... I
meant to talk to you about that. So that happened shortly after he left prison, because, of course, Curtis Cocky Warren was the biggest cocaine kingpin in the UK. He was using Liverpool as the port of entry, which is supposed to be as significant a territory as Amsterdam when it comes to doing deals and bringing in drugs. He was famously arrested after a sting carried out by the UK and the Dutch police. And he was found to have corrupted a very high-level police officer. He was jailed for 20-odd years. And when he was coming out, he was put under these really strict conditions. I mean, I don't think he was allowed to have more than 200 quid in his bank account.
No, I mean,
it was so strict.
So strict, 200 quid. He couldn't have a second phone. He couldn't, I think he basically had to have an old Nokia 3210 or whatever it is. Like you couldn't even have certain types of smartphone. He couldn't, I think he had to get permission for leaving his home address. This is all post-sentence. And it's something called, I think the name of it is a serious crime order, where these people have to abide by these conditions almost indeterminately. There is, the British police have said they may seek one on Thomas Maher, actually, who's an Irish haulier who's been linked to all sorts of criminal networks across Ireland and the UK. So they're very onerous in that way, and very long term. It's effectively like a life sentence.
Well, it's not if you get, I mean, if you breach it like Curtis Warren, he gets a suspended sentence, a rap on the knuckles, and off he goes again.
Yeah, but all he was doing, I don't think they were suggesting he was off up to organised criminal activity. He was off seeing his girlfriend up in Newcastle, who happened to be also his former prison warden that he'd had an affair with. He was supposed
to be staying away from her as well, I think, as part of the order.
He's part of the order, yeah.
But it's so, we often fall into the discussion about what did they do after these big, huge criminal careers, and what did they do other than fall back into them, because it is near impossible to find the same excitement or buzz out of a regular job, or even through their community service or whatever it is they will do. They don't know any other way of making a living. And how do you, I mean, the idea that it's come up in Parliament in Scotland about, how do you control these massive, big sort of kingpins when they're coming out and stop them getting back in the game? How do you? You have to just police them and catch them again.
Yeah. I mean, if you look at it, Stephenson there...
They're not going to follow rules, are they?
No, they're not. And I mean, the temptation for him, if you look at that operation he had, it's really one big shipment. And, if he lands that and gets away with it, he does have this huge amount of money that he can make out of it.
He could be set up for life and never touch anything criminal again. Yeah, but
until the next opportunity.
Until the next, because it seems to be that the criminality is the drug.
I suppose the risk taking, that belief that it worked the last time, it's going to work this time. I can't see any flaws in the operation. It must be hard to for somebody to suggest, well, here you can make 50 million or nothing.
So Jamie Iceman Stevenson, 59, going to probably serve his 60th year behind bars, and then he could be potentially jailed until his 80s.
undoubtedly he'll serve his 70th year behind bars as
It's a
well,
little
I would
bit,
imagine.
another one bites the dust with it, isn't it? There seems to be just two ways rather to finish this. A criminal career. It's in jail or dead.
Or in Dubai.
Actually, sorry, I concede that.
Yeah.
3 ways are living in utter luxury.
In Dubai.
In a gilded cage, as we call it,
Yeah.
in Dubai, under the sun and the palm trees.
Too hot, though. Too hot by all accounts.
Yeah, exactly. Thanks, Niall.
Thanks, Nicola.
I'm Nicola Tallant, and you're watching Crime World, a podcast about criminals, drugs, and the underworld in Ireland and across the globe. Make sure you subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you can be the first to watch all our latest episodes. You can also listen wherever you get your podcasts.